Around this time of Elizabeth's amazing, excuse me, around the time of Elizabeth's amazing pregnancy and John's birth, the emperor in Rome, Caesar Augustus, required everyone in the Roman Empire to participate in a massive census. The first census since Quirinius had become governor of Syria. Each person had to go to his or her ancestral city to be counted. Mary's fiance Joseph from Nazareth in Galilee had to participate in the census in the same way as everyone else. Because he was a descendant of King David, his ancestral city was Bethlehem, David's birthplace. Mary, who was now late in her pregnancy that the messenger Gabriel had predicted, accompanied Joseph. While in Bethlehem, she went into labor and gave birth to her firstborn son. She wrapped the baby in a blanket and laid him in a feeding trough because the inn had no room for them. Nearby, in the fields outside of Bethlehem, a group of shepherds were guarding their flocks from predators in the darkness of night. Suddenly, a messenger of the Lord stood in front of them, and the darkness was replaced by a glorious light, the shining light of God's glory. They were terrified. "Don't be afraid," said the messenger. "Listen, I bring good news, news of great joy, news that will affect all people everywhere. Today, in the city of David, a liberator has been born for you. He is the promised anointed one, the supreme authority. You will know you have found him when you see a baby wrapped in a blanket lying in a feeding trough." At that moment, the first heavenly messenger was joined by thousands of other messengers, a vast heavenly choir. They praised God. As soon as the heavenly messengers disappeared into heaven, the shepherds were buzzing with conversation. "Let's rush down to Bethlehem right now. Let's see what's happening. Let's experience what the Lord has told us about." So they ran into town, and eventually they found Mary and Joseph and the baby lying in the feeding trough. After they saw the baby, they spread the story of what they had experienced and what had been said to them about this child. Everyone who heard their story couldn't stop thinking about its meaning. Mary, too, pondered all of these events, treasuring each memory in her heart. The shepherds returned to their flocks, praising God for all they had seen and heard, and they glorified God for the way the experience had unfolded, just as the heavenly messenger had predicted.
When I was a child, like most children, I suspect, adults would ask me the question, "What do you want to do when you grow up?" I suspect that you got that question as well, or if you are a child or a young person, you probably get that question now. I can't know for sure, but I think there are probably lots of kids who struggle with this question. I think I struggled with it because I didn't really know what I wanted to be. How could I know what I wanted to do when I hadn't done any of the things that I thought about doing? I had never been a teacher. I had never been a writer. I had never been a veterinarian or any of the professions that I thought about or that I learned about. I think children get pretty good at understanding adults' expectations, and they get good at giving answers to the adults that the adults would like to hear. Perhaps adults, and especially guidance counselors, might be wise to heed the words of the Trappist monk and theologian Thomas Merton, who said, "People may spend their whole lives climbing the ladder of success, only to find that once they reach the top, the ladder is leaning against the wrong wall." Perhaps we adults would be wise to ask the question this way: who do you want to be? Or even better, how do you want to be? What sort of presence, not present with a T, but presence with a C, do you want to bring to the world? Throughout this Advent season, we've been exploring the theme of reflecting the sacred and pondering the question, what if all things are reflections of the holy? For the past 4 weeks, we've explored sacred time, sacred people, sacred space, and sacred knowing. And tonight we are pondering the theme of sacred being. And by sacred being, we're not talking about physical beings, as in creatures, but being itself. Aliveness, presence, being. As Richard Rohr, the Franciscan theologian, is fond of saying, God is not a being. God is being itself. Or to put it another way, the feminist theologian Mary Daly said, God is not a noun, God is a verb. Or as the Apostle Paul said, God is the one in whom we live and move and have our being. In Richard Rohr's version of Franciscan theology, recognizing our sacred being is recognizing what he calls the universal Christ. The universal Christ is God's love for all of creation. And this love didn't start at the birth of Jesus 2,000 years ago. It has existed from the very beginning, for all of the 13 plus billion years since the universe began. This love is ours, as Pastor Jeff reminded us earlier, not because we've been good, like God is Santa Claus, but simply because we are beloved of God. Our very being reflects the sacred. The incarnation of God in human flesh that we recognize tonight in the person of Jesus is proof of that love. It is perhaps easiest on this most holy night to look around and see the beautiful, shiny decorations and lights in our church, in our homes, in our communities, and be reminded that the holy is sparkling everywhere in the world. It's a bit more difficult, I think, to know how to hold on to our experience of the sacred and to carry it with us every day of our lives, to, as the character Ebenezer Scrooge says at the end of A Christmas Carol, to honor Christmas in my heart and try to keep it all the year. We need reminders. One of the ways that we remind ourselves of the sacred is through ritual. Our rituals tonight are not just about keeping tradition, but about reminding ourselves of the birthing of the sacred into the world. We sing songs together and tell ancient stories and share the light, all and as a way of declaring that this is sacred time and we are enfolded in sacred presence. In the ancient world, one of the rituals used to mark a person or a place as sacred or holy or sovereign was the ritual of anointing. In the Old Testament, we read stories of the people anointing the tent of the tabernacle and the ark of the covenant, and of Samuel anointing the heads of Saul and David as king over all Israel. The Psalms also mention anointing. Perhaps the most well-known reference is from Psalm 23, when the psalmist says, "You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows." The tradition of anointing continues in the New Testament. In the Gospel, according to Mark, Jesus sends the disciples out to anoint the sick and heal them. Jesus himself is anointed. All four Gospels tell a similar story of a woman, sometimes named, sometimes not, using a precious perfumed ointment to anoint his head or his feet, identifying him as the sacred one of God, the Messiah, the Christ, the anointed one. It is a sorrow to me that this ritual is not remembered as important as the rituals of baptism and communion in our Christian faith. I think I know why, but that is the subject of a different sermon. One of my most favorite stories of anointing Jesus is actually not in the Bible. It's a story associated with Bridget of Kildare, one of the patron saints of Ireland. You are probably more familiar with St. Patrick, but Bridget is also considered one of Ireland's patron saints, the patron of poets, of healers, and shepherds. And for those of you who enjoy a brew, she is known as turning water into beer when there wasn't enough beer. An entire lake full of beer. She shares her name with the great Celtic Earth Mother goddess, and there's some speculation as to whether she was an actual person or just a co-opting of the ancient goddess by the emerging Christian faith in Ireland and Scotland. If she was a real person, it is believed that she lived between 451 and 523, and that her mother was a Christian and her father was a Druid priest. Given this, she is one who straddles the Celtic pagan religion rooted in the belief that nature is sacred, and the Christian tradition with its emphasis on Jesus as the incarnation of the sacred. She is deeply revered in the Celtic Christian tradition, and there are many myths and stories about her. One of these stories is that she was the midwife to Mary at the birth of Jesus. It does not matter that Jesus was born just before or after the 1st century, and that Bridget was born sometime in the 5th century. It does not matter that Bridget lived in Ireland and that Jesus was born half a world away in Bethlehem. According to the story, angels carried her across the sea, and apparently across time as well, all the way to Palestine, to Bethlehem, bringing her there in time for the birth of Jesus. Bridget carried with her a shell full of water, and when she arrived at Bethlehem, after helping Mary bring Jesus into the world, she anoints Jesus with 3 drops of water from her shell. As fantastical as this story is, I love it. I love the idea that Bridget, the great mother saint of the Celts, one representing the Celtic belief that the sacred exists in all creation, is the one who anointed Jesus in the very beginning, anointing him into the tradition of Celtic spirituality, a tradition that believed that to look into the face of a newborn is to look into the face of God. In a few moments, we will practice the ritual of anointing ourselves or each other as a reminder of our sacred being, of our connection with all that is, with the active verb that is God. We do this to help us remember to carry that sacredness into the night, into the world, to keep Christmas in our hearts all year long. We do this to help us to see the sacred in all things, all people, all places, all times. We do this to remember how we want to be in the world, what presence we want to bring to it. Friends, may we carry the Christ this night.